Long and talk a little bit about climate and environment initiative. Over here, what we're looking to do is really striving to implement solutions to really, solve some of the really challenging high impact problems in this space. There's a lot of opportunity to break down data silos, create trustable information sources that can be used, say, by like policymakers and others. There's a lot of opportunities in like ESG rating, things like that. And at the end of the day, we're trying to use the same Lydian technology to do similar things. It's getting participants to put the desired outcomes, the right outcomes, and prioritize those to make sure that, hey, we're delivering on, the promise to improve ecosystems, reduce emissions, all of those things. So, we look at it from kind of like a twofold perspective, one from like that incentives, but also just as importantly from like a traceability and making sure we're collecting all the data. To talk about that point, like on the climate reporting, I'm going to introduce Martine actually. Martine, if you can, if you're there.
Thank you, Sertaj. It's a pleasure to join all of you to discuss this exciting field. My name is Martin Weinstein. I'm the founder and lead scientist at the Open Innovation Lab at Yale University. I direct a program on finance at the Digital Currency Initiative at the MIT Media Lab, and I'm also the founder and executive director at the Open Earth Foundation. All of those hats really just point to my work, which explores how do we build open digital infrastructure to better manage our Earth system with a big focus on climate and the transformation of the energy system, and where emerging digital technologies and multi-stakeholder collaborations come together for that. It's in many ways, just like we talked about the data economy OS operating system, we still lack an Earth system operating management platform, and so a lot of that is what I like to focus on. That's my intro.
No, thanks, Martine. Hey, let's get into some of the issues that you've seen in terms of like climate tracking, the reporting. What are the challenges over there, and what are the what is the work that we've been talking about doing in that space?
Yeah, and I'm going to start by borrowing nice things that Arka illustrated at the beginning. How does data help tell a story? And when it comes to climate, and when it comes to our management of our planetary carbon budget, the physical amount that we can still put into the atmosphere before we cross tipping points, it really has to bring in and bridge all the information of our emissions or our mitigations at the supply chain, at the operating level, at the energy infrastructure level, all the way into how we also manage our large policy instruments internationally. For example, the UNFCCC Paris Agreement. And so there is a crux in the process, which is if we just think between the private sector and public sector divide, as part of being able to tell a story about climate, but also how we manage our emissions going forward, there is a need for radical transparency. In fact, transparency is a fundamental part of the Paris Agreement. However, for corporations and supply chain managers and product developers to be able to transparently report their emissions, first they need to be able to have visibility around all of those operations, and emissions are invisible. So when you have a methane leak in a process, unless you have sensors on the ground, you'll not be able to tell the story that part of your product also created methane leaks. And then the second part is, once one has visibility of those emissions within the boundaries of scopes of an operation, how does that get reported and broadcasted transparently alongside retaining data privacy? And this is a key crux that we've discussed all today. In the climate space, this is very important. How can I share data derivatives? So what's the aggregate of my emissions without providing all the information of my operations, where my emissions are happening? And this falls into, just to think about three important categories. What does that transparency of data means to policy? What does it mean to investors if we think about ESG? And what does it mean to end consumers that are buying products?
Hey, awesome. And then, we've been working on a few different things, Martine, in terms of solutions. And do you want to tee up a little bit about just maybe a brief overview of what it looks like?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of what also Arca described is to be able to create this network of data. One has to really start mapping out the whole process from the sensors all the way to even at a company level. There's many different filters where climate relevant data has to pack to, and then where does that get disclosed to the ultimate party. And one thing that's very important, just to focus on policy, is once a public sector entity, let's say obviously at the national level, but at a subnational level, such as the state of California, has a specific target and wants to roll out incentives for companies and private sector participants to fill out and fulfill that target. It is very important that the public sector needs to be able to rapidly audit that data and have access to it. At the same time, penalize it if a company is overly emitting and it really makes it hard for that jurisdiction to fulfill its climate data. How is it going to manage that? And this is where working with Lydian on creating the data economy structure between private and public is very important to create smart dynamic policy that really has to respond to also what's the state of the planet. And one of the exciting projects that we've been working on is, particularly because we operate a lot here in California, and California is quite at the forefront of this. How does legislation, for example, can roll out where we ask from our private sector companies to disclose information transparently, whilst ensuring that they maintain privacy of that, and that becomes a very cheap to disclose and cheap to audit, because often both the private sector and the public sector have a lot of resistance of it, because having to audit all of that information and ensure that there's trust is very expensive. So by linking everything digitally and creating all the cryptographic relationships, this can be done ideally in the not so distant future, as we're working on it in almost real time.
Thanks. Just a point of housekeeping here. I know some people have sent us notes that they've got to drop off. So just to remind everybody, we are recording this entire session and we'll package that up for you. So anything that you miss, you can get to later. We're just going to keep going. We're going to go through the Q&A time. And then those of us who can, I'll stay on longer to answer more things from the Q&A if we get more questions in. So don't worry, if you have to go, you won't miss anything. We'll make sure you get the content.
Hey, Jen, thanks a lot. Still on, like to introduce our other two partners in the climate and environment space, Sean Penrith and Daniel Pike. If you guys would like to just introduce yourselves real quick.
Yeah, hi, this is Sean Penrith. I'm with Gordian Knot Strategies. I'm based in the Pacific Northwest and work closely with Daniel. We're climate finance consultants. So we work with two groups of stakeholders, if you will, those who have money and want to place it for maximum environmental impact, and those that are doing the impact and need money. And what is key to all of this is being able to successfully translate the type of impact that's actually happening on the ground, which relies on data in the ag, the forestry, the marine permaculture space. There is just a void of linked data systems. And most of these projects, because nature-based solutions offer such significant potential to meet our targets under the Paris Agreement, most of these approaches need some sort of incentivization, but you can't create an incentive program unless you can actually measure the impact on the ground. And so Daniel and I are continually confronted with this sort of challenge. I'll hand it over to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Sean. Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Pike. I work closely with Sean at Gordian Knot Strategies, and I am also the co-founder of a nonprofit called the Drylands Natural Resources Center, which is an integrated agroforestry, reforestation, and rural development project in Kenya. It's an example of one of those projects that's having impact and needs money, right? So the project generates a whole range of environmental, social, economic benefits. We think it does that in quite an efficient way. but the challenge we've had, and we've had it for over 10 years, is being able to measure that impact, right, and communicate it to other people using data. So that's a small project, and it's just one of the many that Sean and I are involved in and work with. But that challenge of being able to measure and communicate the impact you're having, and then get duly rewarded and compensated for that is one that cuts across the climate and environment space. Obviously, it links to the idea of industry tracking what's happening in its supply chain and transparency around that. It links to carbon markets, and I think it links a lot to the agriculture pillar that Lydian's working on as well, and that Hugh's going to speak to in more depth and sophistication than I can.
Yeah. Hey, why don't we introduce Hugh as well? Hugh, I think you're there as well.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
My name is Hugh Locke. I have had a career in the international community that has overlaps between environment, sustainable development, and humanitarian service. And 15 years ago, I decided to narrow that focus to Haiti. And 10 years ago, teamed up with a Haitian agronomist named Timothée Georges. And together we created something called the Smallholder Farmers Alliance. Our initial focus was on planting trees. And to that end, we've planted close to 8 million trees since our start in 2010.
Hugh, thanks. I'd love to hear. I'd love to have you share a bit more about the issues you're seeing, as well as like the data collection programs you've started to start to address some of the problems.
Well, our first challenge when Timothée and I set out to plant trees, we approached smallholder farmers, the only logical people in Haiti to do the tree planting, and they were not interested because they said, "What's in it for us?" And so we had to establish a value proposition for planting trees. And what emerged was that there were three key things smallholder farmers needed but didn't have. And so we said, all right, if we supply those three things, seed, tools, and agricultural training, and ask you to plant trees in order to receive those three things, are you on board? And so that set the basis for the Smallholder Farmers Alliance. And now we have 6,000 members that farm 3,000 farms in 7 different parts of the country, 29 tree nurseries. But the whole thing centered on the value proposition. Plant trees in order to earn agricultural services. And so we call the results tree currency. So that was our first big challenge. Then, as we got larger, we realized we needed to have some way to track and measure what we were doing. And at that point, we reached out to Columbia University. And over the course of 3 years, we developed the basis for a data app specific to smallholder farmers, and did a beta model and field testing of that app. And that was the point at which we met Lydian, thank goodness, because we didn't know how to take it further. And so we're now looking at how do you take these various kinds of data and monetize them, make that useful both to smallholder farmers and eventual consumers of various agricultural products.
Hugh, thanks so much. Marco, I want to ask you to maybe come on and talk a little bit more about, some of the tools from a technology standpoint that, that are going to be available for smallholders and as well just in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what Hugh and Daniel and Sean all refer to, and in fact, even Martin did, is the need for traceability and the need for distributed traceability, where we can track outcomes that might be generated from anywhere from a farm to any other location on the planet, and be able to do what we've been talking about, is manufacture these data assets that have some kind of utility whether it's an incentive or whether it's an analytics or whatever, some combination, we need to have a method to do that. So at its heart, the agricultural platform is very similar actually to the metals traceability platform that Abhinav and Vipin have been developing, where the core components will essentially let us track and create this really interesting portfolio of data assets that are based on agricultural inputs. We've been working with Sean and Daniel on some concepts around agroforestry and creating incentives for farmers to move to more sustainable farming methods. That is a use case that the traceability platform can provide. And then built on top of that is what we're working with Hugh and Rob on, which is the smallholders platform. And that is so exciting because, as you know, Hugh and I have, you've recently gotten excited about the idea of a platform, but that is the cool thing about a platform is that, you know, the same smallholders platform can not only provide a basis for these economic incentives, such as implementing tree currency as assets and kind of taking that concept and spreading it out and essentially giving farmers and smallholders a portfolio, an alternative source of wealth, if you will, an alternative source of assets that they can use to gain incentives for their farms and to grow their business and to, you know, a higher quality of life, while also having a more positive impact on the climate, on gender equality, and all the other things that Hugh, the Smallholder Farmer Alliance, and others are working on. And the same platform can be then extended to do very interesting things like self-certification models for large manufacturers who don't necessarily want to depend on expensive third-party processes and want to have first-hand visibility, want to make sure that they can provide incentives back straight to the smallholder farmers, all the way to essentially creating this entity out of, like, let's say, a smallholders data economic network that can then trade with large organizations, whether they are global manufacturers, whether they are folks like food groups, and so on and so forth. So it's just something that has become very, very interesting and very, very important to us very, very quickly. And, you know, all thanks to Sean, Daniel, Hugh, and Rob. So really excited about that.